When Dave got on the bus, he suddenly realized that he no longer had a band or friends. A 4-day journey to California lay ahead of him, but he didn't have a single dollar in his pocket. All he had with him was a bag of dirty laundry and his guitar. For those 4 days, he was forced to beg fellow passengers for spare change, trying not to starve, and people helped him. At one point, Dave noticed a handbill lying on the floor. To pass the time, he decided to read it. In the handbill, California Senator Alan Cranston was discussing the threat of nuclear war. Part of the text was highlighted in bold. The arsenal of Megadeth can't be rid no matter what the peace treaties come to. That line inspired Dave to write a new song. He immediately borrowed a pencil from a passenger and began writing on a cupcake wrapper. He titled the song Megadeth, not yet realizing it was the perfect name for a thrash metal band. After returning to California, Dave had to ask his mother for help. She fed him and gave him a place to sleep. The same room he had shared with James shortly before moving to San Francisco. When meeting old friends in the evenings, whenever the conversation turned to Metallica, Dave told them he had left the band on his own. But it turned out Lars had already called mutual friends to inform them that Dave had been fired. Dave increasingly thought about starting his own band. He wanted revenge. The idea was to create the ultimate monster, and that meant finding the best musicians. He didn't want to fill the lineup with just anyone. Struggling with poverty and no money, Dave took a job making cold calls, trying to sell products over the phone. The guy who helped him get the job was named Robbie, and he played guitar. Another coworker, Matt, played bass. That's how the band Falling Angels was formed. Dave's plan was to start a band at any cost, and later replace the weak links. After saving enough money, he rented an apartment on Hollywood Boulevard. On June 1st, 1983, 2 friends from Minnesota, David Ellefson and Greg Handevidt, moved into the apartment below his. Fresh out of high school, they came chasing a dream to conquer the Los Angeles music scene. One morning, David and Greg decided to jam and started playing Van Halen's Running with the Devil. Suddenly, they heard someone yelling loudly, "Shut up!" They kept playing, and something smashed against the window air conditioner. The guys stopped and looked outside. A shattered ceramic flower pot was sitting on top of the unit. For 2 guys from Minnesota, that kind of behavior was shocking. The next day, they noticed that a blonde guy who looked like a rock and roll musician probably lived upstairs. That evening, David and Greg went up and knocked on the door behind which music was playing. Dave Mustaine cracked the door open without removing the chain. Holding a glass of wine, he asked,
"Who is it?"
Do you know where we can buy some cigarettes?
"Down the street, on the corner."
Dave slammed the door in their faces. The guys decided to try again. Dave opened the door irritated.
"What?"
Are you old enough to buy beer?
Dave paused for a moment, then opened the door and invited them in. There was also a singer there named Lor Kane. Gradually, a conversation started. They went out and bought a case of beer, and along the way, Dave told them wild stories about the band he used to play in. In his apartment stood 2 Marshall stacks and a BC Rich guitar. Dave played them a couple of songs, including his new track, Megadeth. The guys were blown away, both by the songs and by Mustaine's guitar skills. The next day, Greg said, "We have to play with this guy." Ellefson had doubts. He was a solid bass player, but he felt he wasn't on Mustaine's level. Besides, classes at the Institute were about to begin, and working with Dave clearly meant a very different kind of lifestyle. But Ellefson also understood that this was his chance, and he had to take it. Within a few days, they were already rehearsing together. Ellefson played well both with his fingers and with a pick, and Dave highly praised his technique. That's how the new lineup came together under the same name, Fallen Angel. Lor handled vocals, and Greg played second guitar. They rehearsed like that throughout June. One day after rehearsal, the topic of changing the band's name came up. Greg said, "Why not call the band Megadeth?" Lore immediately loved the idea. Wow, Megadeth. That sounds so heavy. But Dave didn't like the word death. It felt like a cliché for a metal band. Having some interest in numerology, he decided to drop the second A so the name would have 8 letters, the number of infinity. Dave was extremely strict about everything related to the band's image, so every detail, from clothing to members' names, had to be carefully considered. He said there couldn't be 2 Daves in the band. Lore suggested calling Ellefson by his middle name, War, short for Warren, but that didn't sound right. One day, while they were at a grocery store, a friend named Peyton called Ellefson Junior Dave. Mustaine overheard it, laughed, and said it was perfect. From that point on, he started calling him Junior. Ellefson hated the nickname, but it stuck. Dave helped Greg and Junior get jobs at the same company where he worked. Every morning, they rode there together in Ellefson's van. Dave was excellent at the job. He was an extrovert and turned on his charm, which helped a lot in sales. The same couldn't be said about Ellefson. Every time he had to force himself to pick up the phone and push people into buying. On July 25, 1983, Metallica released Kill 'Em All. When Dave first heard it, he was shocked. 4 of his songs were included on the album. In addition, songwriting credit was shared with Hetfield and Ulrich. Mustaine was listed last. No one had contacted him to ask for permission. It was a serious blow. From that moment on, Dave decided that Megadeth had to be better than Metallica in every way. Faster, heavier, more intense. Dave didn't like Greg's appearance. He didn't look rock and roll enough, so he told Ellefson that Greg didn't belong in the band. They went downstairs, and Mustaine told Greg he was out. Ellefson, not knowing what to say, just stared at the floor. A tough choice for a best friend. Greg was angry and hurt. He packed his things and moved back to Minnesota. And not long ago, Dave himself had been in Greg's position. That's the brutal reality. Ellefson had to move out of the apartment, and he and Dave ended up staying with Peyton, who lived with his sister and her husband. Not the best arrangement, but they had no choice. Dave continued writing songs. Around that time, Looking Down the Cross and Devil's Island were written. The song Megadeth later became the basis for Set the World Afire. Dave was also working on The Skull Beneath the Skin, whose original working title was Self-Destruct. Soon, drummer Lee Rausch joined the band. They also needed a powerful vocalist, so they frequently held auditions. But when yet another candidate failed to show up, Dave decided to try singing himself. He knew nothing about proper breathing technique or vocal cord control. He was all red-faced afterward. But at that moment, it became obvious to Ellefson that Dave had to be the singer. He encouraged him every step of the way. This happened right before New Year's, and by February 1984, Megadeth had already played their first shows. The band needed a second guitarist. Kerry King knew Mustaine from his days playing with Metallica. Even though he was already a member of Slayer at the time, he didn't miss the opportunity to play with Megadeth as well and fit into the lineup perfectly. A week before their first show in San Francisco, the guys attended a party at Curly Joe's studio. When they walked in, they found themselves in complete chaos and debauchery. Even for Dave, who had seen a lot, it was too much. They decided to leave and rushed down the stairs. On the way to the door, they collided. Lee Rausch fell and broke his leg. Megadeth's debut performance was suddenly at risk. Dave convinced Lee to remove part of the cast before the show. When they did, they saw his leg was in terrible condition. Despite that, he played the concert, pushing through the pain. But when they returned to Los Angeles, Lee announced that he needed to find himself and the meaning of life, so he was leaving the band. Kerry King didn't stay long either. After playing 5 shows with Megadeth, he returned to Slayer, newly inspired to continue what he had started there. In the end, Mustaine and Ellefson were once again left alone, just the 2 of them, when suddenly record labels began showing interest in the band. On March 9, 1984, Megadeth released their first demo, Last Rites, which included 3 songs: Love to Death, Mechanics, and The Skull Beneath the Skin. After Lee Rausch left, the band was in need of a drummer. In the summer of 1984, Mustaine and Ellefson met a guy named Jay Jones, who became a sort of unofficial manager for Megadeth. This marked the beginning of a darker chapter in their story, because Jay was known as a street dealer and was connected to the rougher side of the scene. He recommended drummer Gar Samuelson, who played in a progressive jazz style but had issues with substances. Gar showed up to the audition at Mars' studio already high. When Dave walked into the room, he found Gar asleep in a chair with a lit cigarette between his fingers, nearly burning his skin. Mustaine circled around him, trying to assess whether Gar fit the band's image. What threw him off was the footwear, capezios, which Dave associated with glam rock. But once Gar woke up and started playing, everything fell into place. He fit perfectly. Gar had a friend, Chris Poland. They had both come from Dunkirk to California chasing fame and success, playing in a jazz fusion band called the New Yorkers. Jay Jones had previously managed that band too, and he wanted Chris to audition for Megadeth. Chris first heard Megadeth at a club called Waters in San Pedro, where Gar had invited him. After that, he went to Mars Studios, where Mustaine and Ellefson were living and working. Dave listened to Chris play and was impressed. He was a highly skilled guitarist with a jazz background, exactly what the band needed. At that point, the lineup was complete. After Mustaine and Ellefson moved out of the studio, they basically lived wherever they could, with friends, girlfriends, or in a van. Because they were often high, things could get pretty intense. One time, while driving around the city, Chris got into an argument with some girls. Dave pulled him out of the van and started beating him uncontrollably. The others tried to stop him, but Chris's face ended up badly damaged. Still, that didn't stop them from continuing to play together. Sometimes they'd show up for rehearsal, and Gar would be missing cymbals, drumsticks, or parts of his kit. When Dave asked what happened, Gar would say, "Sorry, Davey, had to pawn it so I could get well." By the time they had enough material for an album, they started looking for major labels. They even flew to New York, but the deals they were offered were unacceptable, so they decided to sign with the independent label Combat Records. When Dave saw the contract, the terms seemed completely one-sided in favor of the label. He decided they needed a good lawyer to go over it. Jay Jones recommended one. During the meeting, Dave fell asleep from boredom while Ellefson tried to stay focused. In the end, as Dave later put it, they made the worst deal in rock and roll history. The recording budget was only $8,000. The album was recorded at Indigo Ranch in Malibu. Half the budget was spent on food and drugs supplied by Jay. That money ran out within a week, putting the recording at risk. The decision was made to fire Jay Jones. Around that time, Mustaine's girlfriend kicked him out, and he and Ellefson moved in with the studio engineer, Carrot Fay. They needed more money, so Dave requested another $4,000 from the label. With a total budget of $12,000, the album Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good was recorded, but not at the level Dave had envisioned. The album needed cover art. Dave had already come up with a concept and designed the logo, even considering getting it as a tattoo. It reflected his views on religion, oppression, and freedom of speech, partly inspired by comic book characters he loved as a kid. Dave asked his friend Peyton to create a sketch which led to the creation of the band's mascot, Vic Rattlehead, a skeletal figure with eyes, ears, and mouth covered, inspired by the Three Wise Monkeys. The sketch was sent to Combat Records for final design. When Dave saw the finished cover, he was devastated. It looked cheap and ridiculous, like a set of Halloween props. When he asked what happened to the original concept, the label said the artwork had been lost. A tour called Killing for a Living was organized to support it, with Megadeth opening for the Canadian band Exciter. But by then, Chris Poland's addiction had become a serious issue, even leading to his arrest. Jay Jones stepped in again and found a replacement guitarist, Mike Albert, who had played with Captain Beefheart. He was an experienced touring musician, about 10 years older than the rest, but he was concerned about the low income from the tour. The tour started in Baltimore on a promising note. Gar arrived late, so Exciter had to go on first. But by the third show, problems began. On the way to Cleveland, their van broke down, leaving them stranded on the highway. Ellefson and the tour manager hitchhiked to find help and ended up renting a Chevrolet Caprice. They returned, transferred all the gear into the car, packed themselves in, and drove to the show. They drove all night with Gar at the wheel. Early in the morning, he took his eyes off the road for just a second and lost control. The car flew off the road at around 80 miles per hour into a ditch, taking a road sign with it. Everyone panicked but miraculously survived. A passing truck helped pull them back onto the road. After a show in Kansas, they couldn't even afford food. Luckily, some local girls took care of them, bringing beer, food, and attention. Dave called the manager at Combat Records and told him everything was falling apart and the shows were being canceled. The response: go home and get a job. It became clear that their relationship with Combat Records had to end. The situation was saved by booking agent Andy Summers, who promised the remaining shows would go on and that they would get paid. That kept the tour alive. When Megadeth returned from the tour, Mike Albert left as expected, and Chris Poland rejoined the band after rehab. Mustaine and Ellefson were still broke. Chris had a girlfriend whose parents were well off, so he wasn't struggling. Gar worked at BC Rich Guitars. Ellefson tried to make some extra money by setting up client meetings to sell solar panels, and he also worked as a manager at Mars Studio, but most of his time went into the band. In the fall of 1985, Megadeth rehearsed south of Los Angeles in an old warehouse converted into rehearsal rooms. Ellefson and Mustaine sometimes slept there because they were essentially homeless. They hung out there and wrote songs for the new album. One day, Dave picked up a bass that Ellefson had removed the frets from and started playing a riff that would later become the intro to Peace Sells. That same day, while they were driving to pick up Gar, Dave wrote the lyrics, and by the next day they were already playing the song. In January 1986, Megadeth went on a short East Coast tour in a cold motorhome. At the shows, in addition to songs from the first album, the band tested out new material. That's when they realized that Peace Sells could become a real hit.